Everyone mocked the curvy waitress until the Mafia boss crossed the room and kissed her in front of everyone. Who would ever love a woman that fat? The words cut across the dining room, sharper than the clink of crystal, louder than the string quartet playing near the window. And then the room did something restaurants like this never do. It went quiet. A fork stopped halfway to someone's mouth. A woman at table 9 covered a laugh behind her napkin, then let it slip out anyway. 2 men near the bar reached for their phones, the way people always do now, hungry to catch a stranger's worst moment and carry it home like a souvenir. Elena stood frozen in the middle of it, a silver tray balanced on her palm, her fingers gone white around the edge of it. Her uniform was pressed. Her hair was pinned back the way the manager liked it. And across the room, the man who had once told her he wanted to grow old with her leaned back in his chair, one arm draped around his glittering new fiancée, and smiled like this was the best part of his evening. He wanted her to hear it. That was the thing. He had chosen this restaurant on purpose. Then a chair scraped against the marble. It was a small sound. In any other room it would have meant nothing. But this room had gone so silent that the scrape landed like a gunshot, and every head turned toward the corner table by the tall windows, where a man in a black suit was rising slowly to his feet. People knew that face. You could see it move through the room like a cold draft, table by table, the recognition and then the fear right behind it. He didn't hurry. He buttoned one button of his jacket, unhurried, the way a man does when he has never once in his life had to rush for anyone. He walked straight toward Elena. She didn't move. She couldn't. She watched him cross the floor with her heart slamming against her ribs, certain he was going to say something, do something, that whatever came next would be one more thing done to her instead of for her. He stopped close. He looked down at her, and there was nothing cruel in his eyes and nothing soft either, just a stillness she couldn't read at all. He lifted her chin with 2 fingers, gentle, and he kissed her. It lasted a single heartbeat, barely that. But it emptied the room of every sound at once, the music and the whispers and the laughter, all of it gone, so that when he stepped back, the silence rang in her ears like she'd been standing too close to a bell. Eleanor opened her eyes. She had no idea what had just happened to her. The man in front of her showed nothing. Marco Ferretti, whose name landlords whispered and whose name made grown men suddenly remember appointments across town, simply reached down and adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, as if he had done nothing more remarkable than pass her the salt. Across the room, the smile had died on the other man's face. "What the hell was that?" Daniel's voice cracked out too loud. He pulled his fiancée closer, an arm tightening around her waist like she might float away. "Is this some kind of joke?" Nobody answered him. Nobody even looked at him. Every eye in the room had gone somewhere else, and for the first time all night, Daniel was not the center of anything. 10 minutes earlier, he had been. He'd planned it, every piece. He knew Elena's shifts. He'd booked the table under a different name so she wouldn't see it on the list. And when she'd come over with the champagne, professional and calm and asking if they'd like still or sparkling, he had stood up out of his chair and slid a diamond onto the other woman's hand right there in front of her, loud enough that the nearby tables turned to look. People had actually applauded. Elena had smiled. She'd said congratulations, and she'd meant to move on, top off the glasses, get back to work. But Daniel hadn't wanted a quiet victory. He'd looked her up and down, slow, letting the disgust show on his face on purpose, and he'd raised his voice. "You know why we work," he'd said, pulling the other woman against him, "because she actually takes care of herself." A few people had laughed. That was the part that always got him going, the laughing. "You always thought somebody'd love you for your personality." He'd tilted his head. "But come on, let's be honest here." His mouth had curled. "Who's gonna pick a woman too fat to look at?" And the laughter had spread, table to table, the way a fire crosses dry grass. Elena had heard cruel things before. She'd heard whispers behind her back her whole life, in school hallways and on buses and in the break rooms of 6 different jobs. She had a whole quiet system for surviving them. But hearing it in that voice, from that mouth, from the one person who'd once held her while she cried, something inside her had come loose from its hinge. She had not cried. She'd dug her nails into the tray and refused. Not here, not in front of him. And that was the moment Marco Ferretti stood up. Now the silence broke. It broke into whispers, and the whispers rolled through the room like weather. Oh my God, did he actually kiss her? That's Ferretti. That's actually him. Somebody zoomed a phone in on her face. A couple by the door didn't even wait for their coats, just stood and moved fast toward the exit, wanting to be anywhere that wasn't in the same room as a man like that. Elena's pulse was so loud she could barely hear any of it. She stared at Marco like he'd walked out of some other world entirely and picked her, of all people, to stand in front of. What? Her voice came out cracked. What did you just do? He didn't answer. He reached into his jacket, took out a fold of $100 bills, and set them on the nearest table without counting them, enough to cover every plate in the room and the trouble of the evening besides. Then he turned toward the door. That was all. Like the kiss had needed no explanation, like it had been the simplest thing in the world to decide. Wait. Her own voice stopped him. She surprised herself with it. She set the tray down on the service station with hands that wouldn't stay steady, and went after him, past every staring face, out through the heavy front doors into the cold. The night air hit her flushed cheeks. The street outside was lined with cars that cost more than the building she lived in. 3 men in dark suits stood near a black sedan, and the moment Marco stepped onto the sidewalk, all 3 of them dropped their eyes and went still, the way soldiers go still. Elena had never seen anyone treated like that in her life, and for the first time it truly landed on her, cold and clear, exactly how dangerous the man in front of her might be. I asked you a question. He turned around slowly. She searched his face. She'd learned to read faces, working the floor, and she looked for the things she expected to find there: pity, amusement, the little flicker of a man already regretting a joke that had gone too far. She found none of it, just a calm that didn't move. Her eyes filled, the tears she'd fought all night finally coming loose now that there was no one but him to see them. Was that supposed to make me feel better? She said. You don't even know me. Her voice broke on the last word and she pushed through it anyway. I have spent years trying to prove I'm more than what I look like. And now she laughed. A hard, wet sound. Now the whole internet's going to remember me as the fat waitress some powerful man kissed because he felt sorry for her. The words sat there between them in the cold, and for the first time that night, something in his face shifted. Not guilt. She'd have recognized guilt. It was closer to disappointment, and it took her a second to understand that it wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed at whoever, whatever, had taught her to say a sentence like that about herself. He took one slow step closer. I wasn't saving you. She frowned. I was stopping them. His voice stayed low and even. No heat in it at all. They'd already decided what you were worth before you said a single word to them. He glanced back toward the tall lit windows, where faces still hovered behind the glass, watching. They weren't laughing about your body. They were laughing because they'd convinced themselves that humiliating someone made them important, and nobody in that room was going to tell them they were wrong. He looked back at her. So I did. No speech, no raised voice. Just that flat, quiet certainty, like he was telling her the time. You think I kissed you because I pitied you? He shook his head once, a small motion. If it had been pity, I'd have walked past your table and left. Pity walks away. It's easier. She stood there with no idea what to say. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke, and the only sound was traffic hissing by on the wet street. Then one of the men by the car stepped forward, careful, holding out a phone. Sir. Marco looked at the screen. His face didn't change. The video, the man said quietly. It's already up. It's moving. And Elena's stomach dropped straight through the sidewalk, because she understood, suddenly and completely, that whatever had happened to her tonight was not over. It hadn't even really started. She barely slept. By the time grey light was leaking through the curtains, the clip had crossed 500,000 views. She lay in bed with the phone too close to her face, thumb moving on its own, reading things she knew she shouldn't read. He only did it to make a statement. Nobody actually wants a woman like that. Come on. She's loving every second of this. Watch, she'll have a book deal by Friday. She turned the phone face down on the blanket and pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes until she saw sparks. There was no time to fall apart. Her mother would be awake soon. She went down the short hall of the apartment, past the water stain shaped like a country nobody had named, and eased open the door at the end. Morning came weak through the thin curtains and fell across the small woman asleep under a crocheted blanket that had lost half its color. Years of being sick had worn Rosa down to something bird-like, and the bills that came with being that sick had worn everything else down to Elena. "Morning, Ma." She said it with a smile she didn't feel anywhere but her mouth. Rosa's eyes opened and went straight to the dark circles under her daughter's. "You worked the double again." Elena just nodded. She never told her mother the rest of it. She never mentioned that the restaurant wasn't the only job, that most mornings after the late shift, she loaded a rack of fresh loaves into a borrowed van and dropped bread at 4 cafes across the east side before the sun was properly up, so she could be home in time to make breakfast and sort the pills into the little plastic days of the week. 3 hours of sleep had stopped feeling strange a long time ago. She didn't do it because she loved the work. She did it because losing the apartment meant losing the last room in the world where her mother felt safe, and that was not a thing Elena was willing to let happen. Across the city, in a building that put its top floor above every other roof in sight, Marco Ferretti stood at a wall of glass, while one of his men laid a thick folder on the desk behind him. "You ask for everything on Elena Russo. That's everything." Marco opened it without turning around at first, then came and sat and read medical statements, pay stubs from 2 employers, a volunteer certificate from a shelter kitchen, a printed schedule with more overtime hours penciled in the margins than the schedule itself listed. 2 jobs, the man said. Marco turned a page. Sometimes 3. She covers shifts for people who call in sick and doesn't put in for the extra. There's a note here from her manager, actually complaining about it, if you can believe that. He paused. She won't take tips off the older regulars. Refuses them. Tells them to keep it. Another page. Incident reports from the restaurant. A small stack of them. Marco read each one, and the thing that connected them assembled itself slowly in front of him. Every time a customer had caused a scene, every time a plate went back wrong, or a table walked out on a bill, there was Elena's name at the bottom, taking it. Accepting a blame that a dozen small details made clear was never actually hers to take. "Most people never notice her at all," the man said. "She's good at not being noticed." "I noticed." The older man's eyebrows lifted. "How long have you been watching this woman?" Marco closed the folder and rested his hand flat on top of it. "First time I sat in that restaurant, a man came in off the street, older, a veteran, from the coat, asked for a glass of water, nothing more than that. The manager wanted him gone before he'd finished the sentence. He looked out at the city. She ignored the manager, bought the man a hot plate out of her own tips and sat with him while he ate it. 10 minutes, maybe. No cameras, no audience. Nobody in that room was ever going to know she'd done it, and she did it anyway." He was quiet a moment. "You find out who somebody actually is by watching them when they're sure nobody's looking." That afternoon, Elena went back to work, because the rent didn't care about a video. The floor was different. She felt it the second she walked in. Customers who'd never glanced at her twice now watched her cross the room. Some smiled, warm, like they knew her. A few lifted their phones. A woman actually asked for a photo before Elena had gotten to her table, and Elena said maybe later, "Ma'am," in the same voice she used for everything, and kept moving. Her manager caught her by the kitchen door, nervous, wringing a rag he wasn't using. "Elena, there's someone asking for you, up front." She turned toward the entrance and her whole body braced. But it was a little girl, 7, maybe 8, standing beside her father, with her hands behind her back and her shoulders up around her ears the way shy kids stand. When Elena crouched down to her level, the girl brought one hand around and held out a napkin, folded into a lopsided little square. "My mom says you're beautiful," the girl whispered. Then, deciding the credit should go where it was due, she added, "And I think so too." Elena's throat closed, her eyes filled, and this time, for the first time since the night before, the tears weren't the kind that hurt. Across the street, in the back of a parked black sedan, Marco watched it happen through the restaurant window and said nothing. His driver glanced at him in the mirror. "You gonna tell her, boss, that you've been keeping an eye on her all these months?" Marco kept his eyes on the glass, on the woman crouched down talking to a child. Not yet, because there was one thing Elena still didn't know, one truth she wasn't nearly ready to hear. The night they met had never once been an accident. By the end of the week, Elena's life didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to strangers. The 30-second clip had jumped from one platform to the next until it stopped being a video and became a subject. News shows gave it those breathless little titles that run along the bottom of the screen. The Waitress and the Crime Boss. America's most mysterious kiss. Who is the woman standing next to Marco Ferretti? Morning hosts argued about whether it had been romance or strategy or something staged for reasons nobody could name. A man who introduced himself as a body language expert spent 4 minutes analyzing the angle of Marco's shoulders. A fashion account posted a still of Elena's uniform with a laughing emoji and got 60,000 likes for it. Not one of them asked Elena a single question. News sources surfaced every day, anonymous people who knew things. She'd been seeing him secretly for months. She'd staged the whole scene at the restaurant to reel in a rich man. One post climbed past 2 million likes on the strength of a single sentence. Never underestimate what some women will do for money. Elena read it 3 times, and then she locked the phone and set it on the counter, screen down, and stood there with both hands flat on the cold laminate until her breathing came back. She didn't know the woman they were describing. That was the strangest part. They had taken her and built someone else out of her, someone flatter and uglier and easier to talk about. And the whole country preferred that woman to the real one because the fake one made a better story. At work, it followed her from table to table. People started requesting her section. Some of them were kind, genuinely, and she was grateful for those. Others treated her like a coin-operated attraction, asking their questions between bites of a $50 steak. So, a man in an open collar leaned back, smiling. Was it as romantic as it looked, or what? "Would you like more coffee, sir?" Elena said, already pouring. His companion laughed. "Come on, you can tell us. He, your boyfriend now? The mob guy?" Her smile thinned out. "I'm just here to do my job." Even the people she worked beside looked at her differently. Not cruelly, just uncertain, like they weren't sure anymore which version of her was going to show up to a shift, the one they'd known for 2 years or the one the internet had invented. Across town, Daniel was watching every one of those interviews with a knot tightening in his chest. He'd wanted the restaurant to become one more bad memory she carried around, one more night that proved him right. Instead, she turned into someone people cared about, and nobody, not a single soul, cared about his engagement. His fiancée sat across the kitchen island scrolling on her phone, and she frowned at whatever she was reading. "They're calling her inspiring," Vanessa said. Daniel put his coffee down hard enough to slosh it. "Inspiring? She's playing all of them." Vanessa looked up. "You actually believe that?" "I know her." He leaned back with the confidence he wore like a coat. "She's always wanted people to feel sorry for her. She probably set the whole thing up." Vanessa raised one eyebrow, slow. "You think she arranged for one of the most dangerous men in this city to kiss her in the middle of a restaurant?" Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. For half a second, even he heard how stupid that sounded out loud. But pride is a thing that doesn't like to sit down once it's standing, and his was already on its feet. "I'll prove it," he said. "I'll show everybody what she really is." The chance came faster than he expected. A local morning show called. They wanted him on, billed as Elena Russo's ex-boyfriend, the man who knew her before all this. The segment went up online within the hour and traveled fast. "Did she ever mention Marco Ferretti before that night?" the host asked, leaning in. Daniel laughed, easy, made for the camera. "No, but Elena always dreamed of getting out of her boring little life." He tilted toward the lens. "Everyone thinks she's this sweet, innocent waitress. They're wrong. She's sharp. She knows exactly how to make powerful men notice her." Clips of it were everywhere before lunch. Some people believed him. Others watched a man go on television to kick a woman who was already on the ground and hated him for it. The country split down the middle the way it does now over everything. Team Elena. Team Daniel. Somebody made graphics. A cable panel called it the kiss that divided America and ran with it for 3 nights. That evening, Elena sat alone in the dark of her apartment, with the interview playing on the muted television, Daniel's mouth moving, no sound. She reached for the remote to shut it off. And she stopped. A black envelope had been pushed under her front door. Heavy paper. No stamp, no address, no name written across the front in ballpoint. Just 3 words, pressed into the surface in silver. For Elena Russo. She picked it up like it might be warm, slid a thumbnail under the flap. Inside was a single card. And on the card, in the same clean silver lettering, Marco Ferretti requested the honor of her presence at the annual Ashford Foundation Charity Gala. The same gala where, according to 3 separate posts she'd scrolled past that week, Daniel and Vanessa were going to make their debut as an engaged couple. Elena sat with the card in her lap for almost an hour, the television flickering silent light across the walls. She wasn't going because of Marco. She turned that over carefully and made sure of it, because she needed to be sure. She was going because she was tired. Tired of ducking into break rooms when a conversation got quiet. Tired of choosing her routes through her own city around the places people might recognize her. If she kept running out of every room where somebody whispered her name, then those people would get to decide the shape of the rest of her life. And she had already handed too much of her life to too many people who'd never earned it. She wasn't going to hide from a room, not anymore. On the night of the gala, she borrowed a dress off a girl from the bakery. Navy blue, simple, a little long in the hem, so she'd pinned it that afternoon at the kitchen table. There were no diamonds at her throat, no designer bag on her arm. She looked good for one reason only, and it was that when she checked herself in the hallway mirror on the way out, she was standing up straighter than she had in months. Then she walked into the ballroom, under chandeliers that threw light like falling water, and 100 pairs of eyes found her at once. The whispers started before she'd cleared the doorway. That's her. That's the waitress. From the video. He invited her. Personally, I heard. Elena kept her chin level and made for the long table along the far wall, hoping to fold herself into a corner and let the room forget she was in it. She should have known Daniel would never allow that. Well, look who showed up. His voice carried across the whole floor, made for exactly this. Heads turned in a wave. He came toward her with Vanessa on his arm and a smile already loaded, and a couple of reporters near the bar lifted their cameras on instinct, sensing the shape of something before it happened. I honestly wasn't sure you'd have the nerve, he said. Elena stopped, kept her voice level. Good evening, Daniel. He laughed, still doing the whole, none of this is my fault thing. She met his eyes and said nothing, which she'd learned long ago was the one response that got under his skin worst of all. You're famous now. He swept an arm at the crowd, playing to them. Big achievement, for somebody who couldn't hold on to a relationship. A few uncomfortable laughs scattered near the front. Elena took a slow breath through her nose. I'm not here to fight with you. No, his voice went up, filling the room, because the room was the point. You're here hoping Ferretti's going to come rescue you again. A few people actually flinched at the name. You didn't say it out loud in a room like this, not like that. But Daniel was past caring. He was rolling now, the crowd's attention feeding the thing in him that always needed feeding. You fooled every single one of them. He pointed at her, finger straight out, the way you'd pointed evidence. The sweet little waitress. But I know the real you. You always wanted the attention. And the second you figured out that no regular man was ever going to want you, his smile sharpened to a point. You went and found yourself a billionaire gangster instead. A ripple went through the crowd, half of it a gasp. Vanessa shifted her weight beside him, uneasy. Daniel. He didn't hear her. What do you think happened in that restaurant? He spread his arms wide, performing for every camera in the place. A stunt, that's all it was. He kissed you, and you got exactly what you always wanted. Elena's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her wrists, but her voice, when it came, held. You know that isn't true. Oh yeah? He stepped in closer, dropping his voice just enough that everyone leaned in to catch it. Then say it, out loud, in front of all these people. Tell them why a man like Marco Ferretti would ever, in a million years, pick someone like you. The ballroom went silent. Elena opened her mouth, and nothing came out. Not because he was right. She knew, somewhere solid in her, that he wasn't. It was that she genuinely did not have the answer. She had asked herself that exact question every single night since the kiss, lying awake with it, and she had never once found the bottom of it. Why her? Of all the people in that room, of all the people in the city, why had he crossed the floor for her? For one long, terrible second, the doubt came back up through her like cold water. Maybe they really did all see her the way Daniel was describing. Maybe she really had become nothing more than a curiosity, a thing that happened once and got filmed. Daniel saw the hesitation land. His smile spread wide and easy and cruel. See, he said softly, to the whole room. Even she can't answer it. The silence stretched. And then, at the far end of the ballroom, the string quartet stopped playing. Not paused between songs, stopped. Every musician lowered their instrument at the same moment, as if someone had lifted a hand none of them could refuse. Conversations died in clusters, here, then there, then everywhere. Every face in the room turned toward the tall doors at the entrance. The doors were opening. Marco Ferretti walked into the ballroom in a black tuxedo cut so clean it looked poured on, and his face gave away nothing at all. He wasn't rushing. There was no panic in him, no urgency, none of the electricity that had just been running through the crowd. He simply came forward, one unhurried step after another, and the room did the thing rooms always did around him. It opened. People stepped back without being asked, peeling away to left and right, and a path formed down the middle of the floor that led straight to Elena. His eyes never left her, not once. Daniel's grin was sliding off his face by degrees. He tried to hold it in place and couldn't. Marco passed men who ran companies. He passed a state senator who suddenly found his drink very interesting. He passed the reporters who had gone dead still with their cameras half raised, unsure whether they were allowed to point them at him. He walked past all of it, past Daniel as if Daniel were a coat rack, and stopped beside the woman the entire room had spent 10 minutes judging. He didn't look at Daniel. He didn't raise his voice. He said 4 words. "I believe she's waiting." And he turned his eyes toward the small stage at the front of the room, toward the microphone, as if what happened next was simply the natural order of things and always had been. The room held its breath. Marco crossed to the stage and took the microphone from the event host, who surrendered it with a quick nod and stepped well back. Marco stood there a moment and let his gaze travel over the crowd, slow, table by table, and it became clear, in an uncomfortable way, that he wasn't looking for Elena at all. He was looking at everyone else. He was studying the room the way you'd study a set of accounts that didn't balance. Then he spoke, and his voice carried into every corner without any effort at all. "The biggest mistake being made in this room tonight," he said, "is the belief that you can measure a woman's worth by the size of her dress." A ripple of discomfort moved through the tables. Eyes dropped. A few people found reasons to look at their hands. "I've spent my whole life around powerful people," Marco went on, unhurried. "Politicians, judges, men worth more than most of these guests will ever count. I've watched a great number of them wear very expensive suits over very cheap character." He let that sit. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody in that room was going to interrupt him, and I have learned to tell the difference at a glance. He turned, for the first time, to Daniel. "You looked at this woman for about 3 seconds, he said, "and you decided you knew what she was. You measured her by her body. You mocked her in front of a room full of strangers because you were sure the crowd would pay you for it in laughter." Daniel's jaw worked. "I was just telling the truth." "No," the word landed instantly, flat and final. "You were telling us about yourself." It went through the room like a struck nail. Daniel tried a laugh and it came out wrong, small, and the last of the confidence went out of his face with it. Marco looked back over the crowd. Every person who laughed that night made the same choice this man made. You decided that another human being's humiliation was your entertainment. You mistook cruelty for confidence, because the two can look alike from a distance if you've never had to tell them apart. He paused. "And that is exactly why so many decent people walk around this world believing they're worth less than they are. Because rooms like this one keep teaching them so, and no one stands up." Eleanor felt her eyes fill, and it wasn't weakness. It was something closer to the opposite. Because for the first time in her whole life, someone had put words around a thing she'd been carrying in silence for years, and he'd done it without once asking her to explain herself. Marco stepped down off the stage. He crossed the floor and stopped a few feet in front of her, and the ballroom leaned in without meaning to. "The kiss," he said, and he looked directly at her before he finished it, "was not a performance." He held her eyes. It was not charity. It was not pity. It was the first honest thing that happened in that restaurant all night. No cameras flashed. Nobody applauded. The silence itself became the loudest answer the room could give. "When every person in that place had decided your dignity had a price," he said, quieter now, only for her, though the whole room heard it, "I decided not to let them buy it." Elena's breath came uneven. Every word Daniel had ever thrown at her, every laugh, every sleepless night spent turning over the question of whether she was simply not enough, all of it suddenly weighed less. Not because any of it had disappeared, because someone had finally refused, out loud, in front of witnesses, to accept it as true. Marco took one step back, not toward her, away, giving her room, which somehow said more than closing the distance would have. "I can't decide how you see yourself," he said. "Only you can do that. But I won't stand quietly in a room while people teach you to believe a lie about your own worth." Around the ballroom, people who had laughed in the restaurant that night lowered their heads. A few of the reporters quietly let their cameras drop to their sides. Even they seemed to understand that whatever this was, it had stopped being a scandal somewhere in the last 2 minutes and turned into something they didn't have a word for. Daniel looked around for anyone, a friendly face, an ally, one person who'd back him up. There was no one. Even Vanessa had let go of his arm. She was standing slightly apart from him now, and she was looking at him with an expression he had never once seen on her face in all the months he'd known her. Not admiration, not even anger. Disappointment, plain and deep. And then, without a single word, she reached down and slid the diamond off her finger. The ring touched a crystal glass on the table beside her with a small, clear note that carried across the silent room. She set it into Daniel's open hand. For a good 10 seconds, he couldn't move. He stood there staring down at the ring in his palm like it belonged to a stranger. "Vanessa," his voice cracked right down the middle. "Don't do this." She stopped, just long enough to look back at him over her shoulder. "I'm not leaving because another man defended a woman," she said. "I'm leaving because I just watched you spend an entire evening proving you don't know how to." Then she walked out. The tall doors closed behind her with a soft, final click, and the sound of it traveled the length of the silent hall. And Daniel realized, standing alone in the middle of the floor, that every camera in the room had turned. None of them were pointed at Elena anymore. Every single one was pointed at him. Within hours, it was everywhere. But this time, it wasn't the kiss the country was passing around. It was the speech. Millions watched it. Millions shared it. One sentence pulled loose from the rest and traveled on its own. Faster than anything, "You cannot measure a woman's worth by the size of her dress." It turned up on the news and in podcasts and across the front of a morning paper. Teachers wrote it on whiteboards. Parents sent it to their daughters. Support groups reposted the whole clip with a line of thanks for saying out loud the things so many of them had spent years needing to hear from somebody. Anybody. With a room's attention. And then Daniel's interview from the week before came climbing back up out of the feed, and people started running the two things side by side. His grinning face calling her a schemer. Marco's flat voice, 3 days later, taking that apart in front of 500 people. Public opinion doesn't usually turn on a hinge. This time it did, more or less overnight. 2 companies quietly ended their contracts with the marketing firm Daniel worked for. Friends stopped picking up his calls. People who had laughed along with him in that restaurant started untagging themselves from old photos and finding reasons not to be seen with him. Nobody wanted to stand next to a man whose worst evening had become the whole country's shorthand for cruelty. Elena's life changed just as hard, and in the opposite direction. The restaurant booked out weeks ahead, but the people coming in weren't coming to gawk anymore. They were coming to be waited on by the woman who hadn't let a bad night decide who she was. Some of them left folded notes under the salt shaker instead of tips. "Thank you for reminding my daughter that she's enough. You got my wife through a rotten week without ever meeting her. Don't ever let anyone convince you that kindness is a weakness." She kept every one of them in a wooden cigar box under her bed, and on the nights the doubt came creeping back, she took the lid off and read them until it went away. One slow afternoon, an older couple asked for a table, and when Elena leaned in to fill the man's coffee, he stopped her with a hand half raised. "I owe you an apology," he said. She blinked. "For what, sir?" His eyes went down. "I was there that night. At the restaurant." His mouth pressed thin. "I laughed. I didn't know a thing about you, and I laughed anyway." Elena straightened up slowly and looked at him, and she found she wasn't angry. She was just tired, in a soft, forgiving sort of way. "You didn't need to know my story," she said. "You just needed to not laugh." He nodded at the tablecloth, ashamed. "I should have known better than that." And standing there with the coffee pot going cool in her hand, Elena understood something she'd been circling her whole life without ever landing on. Respect had never been a thing you earned by getting thinner, or richer, or famous enough that people finally decided you counted. Respect started one moment earlier than any of that. It started the second a person chose to see another human being before they made up their mind about them. Across the room, the front door opened, and the little bell over it rang. Marco stepped in. No tuxedo this time, just a plain dark coat, damp at the shoulders from the rain. Their eyes met across the tables, and for the first time since that unforgettable night, Elena smiled before he did. He took a quiet table by the window, and for the first time since everything, there were no cameras, no reporters, no strangers whispering behind cupped hands. Just 2 cups of coffee and the soft, steady sound of rain running down the glass. Elena came over, and the smile was still there. "So," she said, setting his cup down, "I guess this time you're actually here as a customer." The corner of his mouth moved. "I've always been one." She laughed, low, and took the seat across from him, which she had never once done for any customer in 2 years of work. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence didn't press on her the way silences used to. It just sat there between them, easy. She looked down at her hands. Then she asked the question that had lived in her chest since the restaurant. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "That night, did you kiss me because you felt sorry for me?" No hesitation, none at all. She raised her eyes. "I kissed you," he said, "because I couldn't stand to watch you believe them for one more second." Her breath caught. "They'd talked you into thinking your worth depended on whether somebody chose you." He shook his head, slow. "But your worth was never a thing they had any right to vote on." The tears came again, and this time they came clean, no shame anywhere in them, just relief so large it barely fit inside her. For years she had gone looking for a person who would finally tell her she was enough. And instead of telling her, he'd shown her the one thing that mattered more, that she had been enough the whole time, all along, back before any of them ever opened their mouths. He reached across the table, then he stopped, halfway, and left his hand there in the middle of the wood, palm up, going no further. "The next one," he said quietly, "only happens if you want it. No push, no expectation, just the hand, resting there, and the choice laid open in front of her." Elena looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled, not because she needed rescuing. She was done needing that. Not because the world had finally decided to approve of her. She'd stopped waiting on that too. She smiled because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she believed in the woman she'd become. She put her hand in his, their fingers laced together like they'd done it 100 times. And this time, it was Elena who leaned across the table and closed the distance. Outside, people hurried past under the rain with their collars up, none of them knowing that the most important thing happening in the whole city that night wasn't in any ballroom and wasn't under any flashing camera. It was in the quiet corner of a small restaurant, where 2 people had finally learned that love doesn't begin the moment somebody saves you. It begins the moment somebody reminds you that you were never, not once, unworthy of being loved in the first place.